I'm not going to get used to that. We'd like to welcome everyone out to the February 7th Planning Commission. This is the pre-meeting. We have commissioners present, save for Commissioner Shelton and Commissioner Marchant. Commissioner Marchant is excused. Have we heard anything from Commissioner Shelton? He may be showing up in a little bit. But for the pre-meeting, we just go over the items. We have training today.
Yes.
So let's just run through. Everybody had a chance to review the minutes. Any questions, comments? Did we want to talk about the Gold Coast Plaza at all? Megan Jensen? Mark's going to do it?
Yeah, I'm filling in for Megan tonight, so she's at home sick, unfortunately. So, but yeah, this one's pretty simple. This is a pole sign over on 9000 South, just in front of a small shopping center. So, with the new road widening that's going to be going in between Redwood Road and I-15, they're just needing to move that sign back to make room for some extra lanes of traffic and a new sidewalk and bike lane and all sorts of fun things.
Sounds good. Thanks. And any questions prior to the meeting that we have? I know it is. It's pretty direct. Regarding the general plan, Ray, did you want to talk about that at all prior to the meeting?
Oh, no, it's going to be pretty straightforward tonight since we've been through all of it.
I love it. Okay. Training, is that Larry or Duncan?
It's me today.
All right. Oh, Julie? Sorry. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Thank you. So Commissioner Marchant is moving, and so she will no longer be joining. I know, which means we have a DRC.
Families over there in favor of against the meat farm.
I'll do it. I'll pick up the slack.
So we've got an opening on DRC. It doesn't need to be a specific item. We just wanted to see if we had any volunteers that would take over on that. Who's on DRC currently?
I'll do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're already on it.
It's teasing.
Yeah, I was like, well, who's on it already? Okay. So Commissioner Hatch will step in on that too.
It's been a few
Thanks.
years since I've done that.
Okay. Now we'll turn the time over to Duncan.
All right, sounds good. So every once in a while, it's good to just kind of review some case law. And one really big Utah, I guess it's Court of Appeals case, is Brown versus Sandy City Board of Adjustment. And just by coincidence, it's a big issue again nowadays, but 25 years ago, it was an issue for them, short-term rentals. But short-term rentals wasn't really the issue. The real issue was what can a city do to, in their city code, to limit certain things, and how should they draft it in the code? How specific should they be? And if there's an ambiguity, is it construed against the city? Those were the types of issues that were at play in the case. And I think it's a really good case to remind us of what we should do, how we should apply the law, and more importantly, how we should draft our code to make sure that if we, as a city staff, as a planning commission, as city officials, if we want something to be in the city code, then we have to be fairly specific, especially with definitions. But the fact pattern of this case was that they had some R18 and R110 zones, and I suspect they're similar to what our equivalent or similar zones are, maybe quarter or fifth acre lots. And there were about 3 sets of landowners that each had a house in one of these zones. And they were just, residential zones, right? You can have single family dwellings. And they had in their code what they meant by it, and they had some. You remember when Rob Wall did some training, and he had that kind of from aspirational or like purpose or intent oriented language in the code on one extreme to the substantive law on the other end of the extreme, right, where there's specific numerical requirements. And of course, the specific numerical requirements are easier to enforce, right? Because somebody either meets the minimum number or exceeds the maximum number or not, right? But in their code for residential, they had some standard language where they said these single-family dwellings that were permitted in these residential zones, the definition was a residential environment that is characterized by moderate densities, a minimum of vehicular traffic in quiet residential neighborhoods favorable to family life. And then they had some additional language like no building can be built that isn't specifically allowed and so forth, right? Then they even, so that's kind of how they defined the zone. And then they defined a single family dwelling as a detached housing unit with certain things in it, right? And excluding accessory apartments and so forth, which some of that's obviously changing today, right? And then they defined a family as two or more people related by blood or marriage, or an individual, or a group of unrelated people up to 4. Our code says up to 5. And so these 3 sets of landowners were in under that code, right? And in each case, they decided, hey, we're going to rent our property out, right? And some of them rented for a few days. Sometimes they rented for several months. But at some point, the Sandy City Community Development Staff Department, they began interpreting their code as prohibiting rentals of single-family dwelling units for fewer than 30 days because they felt that it didn't meet the requirements that I just read, right? That they weren't conducive to family life and so forth. And so these 3 sets of landowners that were leasing out their apartments and a lot of time, or their houses, and sometimes for less than 30 days, they appealed to their Board of Adjustment, right? Which is similar to our current method as well. We have a Board of Adjustment somebody can appeal to. And the Board of Adjustment upheld the community development staff, and then so these people appealed for judicial review in district court, and the district court upheld that they could interpret their code that way. So finally then they appealed to the State Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals overruled it. And there were 2 issues, right? One of the issues was, first off, what standard of review they should use, or burden of proof. And at that time in the state code, there wasn't a standard of review. Standard of review. And so they had what was called a rational basis. And that just basically means when the Board of Adjustment looked at it, all they had to have was any reasonable reason by the city, and then they could rule in their favor, right? As opposed to what the standard that the Court of Appeals ended up applying, and then ultimately the state legislature codified it and put it in state law, and that's what we've lived with ever since, was that the burden of proof is that they have to prove an error, and that the Board of Adjustment has to find that an error was made. So basically an error standard. But so the main issue, really, the second issue was whether then the board erred when they determined that leasing a single-family dwelling for a period of less than 30 days is prohibited by their code. And one of the things the only thing that kind of scares me a little bit about this case, and people have tried to make sense of it ever since, is this language in the court's opinion that that unless you specifically prohibit something, then it's not prohibited. But if you look at the rest of, and so some people have worried about, like with their land use charts, like us, we have a chart that says here's the permitted uses, here's the conditional uses, and anything that's not on there is prohibited. My personal view is, despite the language in this case, that still can be upheld, right? But I think what they were saying more than anything else is that the Court of Appeals was, if you want to, as a city, if you want to prohibit something, some type of thing, not necessarily a use on a chart, but if you want to if you want to limit or prohibit, for instance, setbacks, then you need to put some numerical setback requirements in, right? And so every one of our zones, for instance, has a front, side yard, rear yard setback. If you're in a certain residential zone, you have to be at least 20, your front of your house has to be at least 25 feet back or whatever. If we can't just have general language in our code saying you need to have enough room in front of your house to make sure it's safe, and then just magically on the moment come up with 25 or 30 feet or whatever it is. If we want a numerical requirement, we have to put a numerical requirement in, I think is what the court's saying. Because there's somewhere else in the opinion where they said if Sandy would have put a 30-day requirement in specifically, they could have enforced it and they would have upheld it, right? But they didn't. And so part of what this case is talking about is the notion that the cities have a lot of discretion over what they put in their city codes, right? But because we have that power, if we don't put something in and it's really ambiguous and we can't point to a number, then we can't enforce a number that's not there, right? So in a sense, it gets construed in favor of the applicant, not the city, which is consistent with statutory requirements in contract law for hundreds of years in England. Everything was construed against the drafter of the contract if it was a two-party contract. Similar but slightly different notion. Instead of dealing with contracts, dealing with code. And so as the drafter of the code, we as the city, if we want something specific, especially if it deals with a numerical requirement, we ought to just stick it in there. So and the other thing is with statutory construction is that we look at the plain language. And if the plain language is in our favor, we don't even need to look to legislative intent. So Sandy was not relying upon a number. They were just relying on the fact that transient rentals maybe affect the essential character of the neighborhood, some of those kinds of arguments, and they just didn't work, right? So I think what the takeaways are for how we draft code is, I think the importance of definitions is one thing. I think making it clear with each type of thing in our code, for instance, rentals. I mean, it was clear in the Sandy Code at the time that they allowed houses to be rented, but then they didn't define different types of rentals, right? Short-term rentals or whatever types of rentals they could be. So here's another little quote from the case. It says, "We will not find a violation of law simply because the permitted use may appear inconsistent with the general intent statement when the use is in compliance with the substantive provisions of the ordinance," right? So that's the difference between the general intent versus the substance. And so I think it's kind of an interesting thing to look at tonight when you're looking, for instance, at the general plan, right? And you're looking at what are the important things for the city. And then you're putting those important things in the general plan. And then as we work, if you work on more on the code, then that's where we flesh out the specific numbers and so forth, right? But I still think the general plan is a great guidance for a great starting point. I think the aspirational language in the code is a good transition from, hey, we're trying to apply these principles that are in the general plan. But I think the hardest thing for cities to remember then is to come up with the numbers, the specifics that we can measure and look at and see if they work. And then if necessary, carving out the specific subcategories, like rentals is the main category, short-term rentals is a subcategory. Do we want to treat it differently? what are the numerical standards, at what point is it a short-term rental, is it 30 days or whatever. And a lot of times we go by state law if they've already defined a term. Which I think also dovetails into the other item on your agenda tonight, right? You've got a moving of a sign, and well, Larry and I worked on a code provision that you recommended approval for and the council approved last year for when we already had a provision in our code of how to upgrade existing city signs, or existing signs in the city if they were old and you could replace it for the same or better material. Larry identified here's a subcategory of signs that's more specific in the sense that if it's a government entity like UDOT that's requiring the moving of the sign, and if it technically was a citywide ordinance, but we knew it was mainly applicable in the 1300 West area or whatever. And we knew these were a lot of businesses that had been around a long time. But there was because that was important to the city to carve out a specific subcategory for existing signs that needed to be moved or relocated. And it wasn't at the applicant's own request, but as a requirement of UDOT or some other governmental agency. Here are the requirements. And it was similar to the existing ordinance we had, but slightly different, right? So the thought pattern was subcategory needs specific requirements, and then the specific requirements were in the new code section. They're things that are easily calculable. Somebody either meets those requirements or they don't. It's very objective, right? Not subjective. And I think that's a good example of a city finding a specific area of the law that was important and then crafting a code that specifically addressed it so that now nobody has to make anything up, right? I mean, that comes before you this evening. You can look at it. Staff has already done a report. You can identify through the different requirements, are they met or not. You can either agree with the report or find that one wasn't met. But regardless, it's easy to look at the specific requirements without, quote, making it up, right? That's where the court kind of makes it hard on us if we're in effect kind of making it up. And so because of this case, there were a lot of changes in the state code. In addition to putting in there the standard of review, there's also requirements as far as the scope of review. So on our internal appeals to the Board of Adjustment, cities can decide if it's de novo or on the record. Most of the time, I think we do on the record, which means instead of when it goes to the Board of Adjustment, instead of them hearing the same thing over again that staff or the Planning Commission looked at from ground zero, they're looking at the established record that's already there. They look at the Planning Commission minutes, and so forth. And so the requirement, just so you know, if something gets appealed from staff or Planning Commission to the Board of Adjustment, is if it's on the record, then basically there needs to be substantial evidence on the record for each essential finding of fact. And you're used to how we do findings of fact, and generally staff kind of sets those up for you in the staff report, but basically a piece of evidence for each one, right? That there's either a study, a verbal comment at the public hearing, a document, or whatever. So again, we're not making it up, right? There's something that you can point to for why you made each of those findings of fact, which I think is also a great thing to do. If that's already in the staff report, the documents and all the items, then the motion could be simply, based upon the staff report. I always think too, and the comments, public comments made, and especially if certain comments are specifically on point that help prove the evidence that you're looking at for your essential findings of fact. So one of the reasons why this case is so important is basically that the Court of Appeals made these rulings, and then the state legislature said, oh, those all make sense. And then they just put them in the state code, right? So that's usually when you know the court gets it right, is if the legislature agrees, right? Then, and like I say, the most of it is pretty much just having good and good specific, not just numbers in our code, but good solid definitions, right? Definitions is and sometimes Larry will look at like 12 or 13 other cities and their definitions for a certain thing before he picks which one he uses, because it's that important to get it right. But what questions do you have based upon what I've been talking about?
I have a question. Why would this go through so many approvals or denial of the petition and then have finally the Board of Adjustments overturn all of the rulings? Like, I guess I just don't understand why it would take so many people reviewing the case to not get it right, and why the Board of Adjustments is considered to be right.
Yeah. So, I mean, why did it go all the way to the Court of Appeals? It was staff made a decision, Board of Adjustment agreed, District Court agreed, and then finally Court of Appeals overturned. And you're right. I mean, it looked like it's like a couple of years of litigation, and it wasted a lot of people's time, and probably a couple $100,000 or whatever it was. But and I think that's a great question. And here's my answer to it. And I'm not 100% certain, but based upon everything I've seen, it's that the law wasn't as well built up at that point, right? It's almost like,
What year was this? Was
this
this before?
was it 95 was the fact pattern, 98 was the
So
Court of
then
Appeals decision.
Airbnbs hadn't started, and there were
Right.
no VRBOs.
The market hadn't been tested. In fact, the Court of Appeals says right at the very beginning that these are questions of first impression. Like, hey, this just came to us for the first time. Here's what we think, and they didn't even have anything in the state code, right, to go by. So it was literally like the English judges hundreds of years ago, where Parliament hadn't made a law, and so the judges literally just made it up. Not totally made it up. They kind of took the closest possible laws and tried to kind of match as closely as they could. But this is kind of like a modern day example of that, where it was a new area of law. It wasn't something that was, like it's totally commonplace today, right? They're all over the place. And literally, this case, like I say, helped build the state code that we have now that works and everybody understands. So yeah, nobody would litigate something like this again, because they'd look at state code and go, oh, and
Does Sandy still have that same 30-day? It has to be longer than 30 day.
I'm not sure.
I just think of all the ski rentals that they do in Sandy.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I
I doubt
would be
it.
curious to see where they morphed into after that case.
Right. Yeah, I always meant to ask Rob all that, and I never did. But yeah, I assume that they realized it wasn't in their own best interest at some point to do it anyway. But I don't know that for sure. Other questions?
I was trying to find it in the code, but where does West Jordan sit on this? Do we have specific numbers? I assume we do, considering this.
We really don't. We have like nothing in our code basically on short-term rentals. So technically, then they're allowed, right? But correct me if.
But I think, after this legislative session, you're going to start seeing a lot more of it, because the legislature's once again going to force this upon us. I don't think West Jordan will ever be a big Airbnb rental or, the other type. When I worked in Cottonwood Heights, it constantly was there people that own a condominium and come in for once a year, and then they'd rent it out the rest of the time. But you're close to the canyons. West Jordan's strictly a residential community, and so you might have some, but we don't have anything right now. But there'll be more to come, because I think, Scott, from what we're hearing from Tawny, that I don't think we're gonna have a choice. We're gonna have to put something in our code to deal with it, because we just can't say no.
Well, right now, and Larry's right, I mean, due to our location, it hasn't really been a big enough issue to really codify anything. However, we do have some short-term rentals here, and we treat them as a normal rental. So they come in and they apply for a normal license, a rental license, and so that's how we handle that. Larry's right. We'll likely see some new legislation where we're going to have to carve out a special eddy for them in our code. Either that or just the state will dictate what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, a lot of times, like I say, we carve something out because we see the need ourselves. Sometimes, like as Scott's and Larry are alluding to, the state carves it out for us, right? And sometimes it's maybe in our own best interest financially to do so. And for the first time in some of this proposed legislation, there may be some financial incentives for the city to specifically allow for them as a carved out separate type of rental and so forth. But so yeah, it's an ongoing area of law that's kind of changing. But again, whatever, when the dust settles, whatever the legislature decides, then it'll be clear what's the options are. The city might be able to choose a little bit amongst the options available. But then there's not the same type of risk that would necessitate another Brown versus Sandy Board of Adjustment, right? Because where things were totally unclear. I think the standards are clear now. The legislation's more clear. The only difference nowadays is we may like it or not like it, but at least it's clear, right, what the law is.
And cities have lobbyists, correct? Is there a lobbyist that represents the
Yeah.
cities? And
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we hire lobbyists, and then we have our own internal legislative analyst, Tawny Barker, who that's been her whole career, and she's really good at it. And that's her full-time job this time of year. So, and she coordinates with the other outside people that we use. So, yeah, we're well represented.
The unfortunate thing is, up until about probably 4 or 5 years ago, the state was just happy leaving those type of decisions up to the local government. You know, how you want your community to develop, what you want in your community. But you know, with for lack of a better adjective, the erosion or verb, the erosion of, you know, single family with the accessory dwelling units. Now it's, you know, I've lived my whole life that the single family home was kind of you know, that was the benchmark of, you know, development. You know, you knew exactly what it was. It was one family, one home. Well, that's completely changed. And it's, you know, the state, unfortunately, cities are creatures of state. So we have to just adapt to it the best way. And hopefully the laws they pass aren't so onerous on the communities that it really destroys what you're trying to establish in the community. And so that's my one concern. You know, I think that the farther you get away from the local government, the harder it is to plan, you know, but the legislature obviously feels different. And so that's the reason you know, it's something unprecedented. I haven't ever seen anything like this until the last 5 years, when they've really kind of taken a lot of that roll over and say, you shall do this. And so it's going to be interesting. So
That's probably my last thought, is that if you took all 50 states across the nation, they're either what's called Dillon's rule or Hutchison's rule, which is basically the legislature might say, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do that, but there's always the middle area of what if the legislature says doesn't say you can't do it. Well, in our case, we're the better rule, which is if they don't say one way or the other, then we can do it. In some cases, in some states, it's you can't do it in the gray area, right? If you're not specifically. The problem is the black area of what we can't do gets bigger and bigger, like Larry's talking about. So there's not as much gray area. But so the rule used to be you can do whatever you want as a city as long as it's not unconstitutional or illegal or whatever, except, you know, but nowadays that's the rule, except if the state, you know, preempts us. But you had a question, Trish?
I was going to make a rhetorical comment. How many developers are in the legislature? Just a question.
Yeah. Well, that's the end of my training. Thanks, Chair. Well, like Commissioner Hatch said, it's a rhetorical question that by its very nature needs no answer because everybody knows the answer. So, But yeah. All right, thanks.
All right, it is 6 o'clock, so we will move right into, do I hit this again? All right. All right. Welcome, everybody, to our February 7th, 2023 Planning Commission. All commissioners are present, save for Commissioner Marchins. Our first item on the agenda is approve the minutes. Commissioner Thomas.
I'll make a motion that we approve those minutes.
And Commissioner-
Second.
Okay, so motion by Commissioner Thomas, second by Commissioner Quinney. All in favor? Aye. Aye. Okay, any opposed? Motion carries 6-0. Next item on the agenda, the Gold Coast Plaza sign relocation at 1411 West, 9000 South in a PC zone. Approval of sign materials and design. Neil Knight is the applicant. Mark is handling this for staff.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So again, just to kind of reiterate, Megan Jensen was the planner working on this, but she's homesick, so I'm filling in for her. But anyway, the proposal before you tonight is really pretty simple. It's just to move an existing pole sign that's for the Gold Coast Plaza Shopping Center, just over at 1411 West, 9000 South. There we go. Love technology. But anyway, so this property is located in a PC zone, just planned community zone, and under our current ordinances, pole signs are actually not allowed in that zone. The reason there's a pole sign there is because it was legal at the time it was built. So this particular sign was first constructed and approved by the Planning Commission back in 1987. And back then, there were no real specific regulations on pole signs in a PC zone, so they actually applied the standards for an SC2 zone. And so, so that got approved, got a building permit that same year, and then fast forward to 2003, when the city completely overhauled the zoning ordinances, including the sign ordinances, and added the table that's in our code today, which basically says which types of which sign types are allowed in each specific zone. And so, so back then they kind of took those pole sign allowances out of the PC zone, and that's remained the case until today. So a little bit of history there, but so in other words, the sign is legal, non-conforming, and so with UDOT's plan to widen 9000 South there, essentially they'll be adding 3 lanes of traffic on each side, so 6 lanes total, plus bike lane on each side, and shoulder and park strip and sidewalk. So they're taking quite a bit of land there, or I should say have taken quite a bit of land there. They've already acquired the property. So basically that sign now is in the public right-of-way, and so that's necessitating the need to move it. And so what the city did, and Duncan covered this already in the pre-meeting, but in July of last year, the city passed an ordinance that allowed signs to be moved or modified in some way as a result of road widening, as long as they didn't increase the height or the size. So that is the section of the code that's being applied here. So you can kind of see here on the screen, this is the sign in question, and they're planning to move that back 17.5 feet. As you can see, all the dimensions, the height, the width, it's all staying the same. The only alteration they're going to be making, which is actually required by ordinance, is to add some stone to the base of that sign. You can kind of see here. Now we didn't want them to really increase the height of that stone, and there's a reason for that, which I'll get into in a minute. But anyway, the DRC did review those material enhancements back on the 24th of January and gave a positive recommendation. The only feature that they wanted added was a concrete cap to the top of that to make sure that the stone wasn't just left unfinished. So it's really just kind of more for aesthetic reasons mostly. But anyway, going back to the reason why we had them put that stone up about 4 feet instead of going all the way up to the bottom of the sign is for clear vision zone. So with the way that new sidewalk is coming in, there's really not, basically that sign's going to be in the way of people being able to see oncoming traffic. And so you can kind of see here the I guess you'd call it the elevation drawing showing a 7-foot height and a 3.5-foot height. Well, basically, you don't want any obstructions that are going to be taller than 3.5 feet, but you also, if you've got an obstruction taller than that, you don't want the bottom of that to be lower than 7 feet. So basically, you're kind of creating a vision window, as it were. So that's pretty much what we've tried to do here is just kind of preserve that window between the bottom of the sign and the top of the stone there, just to aid clear vision as much as we can and keep as much of that clear. So that's pretty much it, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions for Mark? Commissioner Wynn?
Who bears the cost of moving this sign?
As far as I know, I believe it's on the applicant. I don't know if there's an agreement with UDOT as far as relocating costs go, but that would be between them and UDOT.
They're compensated by UDOT, is a taking by UDOT, and so they are compensated. So.
Commissioner Hatch?
This sign has always bothered me. It looks really trashy. It's just so, there's so much going on. Our code does not prevent this type of signage. I mean, I've driven past it. We used to take our dogs to laundromats that's right there, and it's impossible to see what's going on. So I just feel like at some point we need to I don't know how you put many businesses on a sign and have it look less cluttered, but this just looks really cluttered. So I don't even know how you fix the code to do that.
Well, and unfortunately, we can't get into the speech part of it. And, it's prohibited by the First Amendment. And so I understand what you're saying. The other one that if this sign would have came down, there's so many businesses behind this bank and behind another business there. There's 13. A monument sign would have been 15 feet long by the, and so you pick your poison, I guess. You go with the I guess better the devil you know than what you end up creating. But it is non-conforming, and so, but the speech part of it, I wish we could enforce a certain standard look on that, but I think we'd run into all kinds of constitutional speech issues. So
Even just the same typeset or the same graphic, the same font, just so it, obviously we can't enforce that, but it would change it considerably if it was consistent.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to what Larry was saying, a lot of the times with the purpose of these pole signs is really kind of to consolidate all of the signage into one single sign rather than having 15 monument signs out there on the front edge. So anyway, just a little context there.
Okay, Julie, is the applicant online? Okay, so Neil Knight, if you're so inclined, floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Good. Yeah, this particular sign, the landlord or the owner of the property we gave him some different options in the beginning, but he just really likes that sign. Now, the structure itself is the only thing that will be moved that is remaining. So all of the tenant signage will be new. And in fact, there's probably some in there that are no longer tenants in that little shopping plaza. So those will be removed. And everything will be upgraded to sign standards of the day. The illumination will be LED lighting, and all the cabinets or the sign portions of those things will be all aluminum. So we will probably paint the structure. Currently, it's like a dark, muddy brown. We'll probably paint it to reflect the color of the building, which is more terracotta, I guess. I don't know. But it'll reflect more of the building than just currently what it is. And we wouldn't be having this conversation if UDOT wasn't involved. So he would just as soon just leave it where it's at. And in the beginning, when we thought we'd have to bring it into compliance, he said, well, I'm not signing off on it if I have to bring it into 50 square feet, as opposed to he's got close to 500 square feet of signage area. So, but that's where we're at, and we just want to move forward with it.
All right, thank you. Turn the time over to the commissioners if you have any questions. Commissioner Wynn?
In the image we're looking at right now, there's another sign behind the one in question, a smaller rectangular sign. Is there an issue with that one as well?
That's the credit union, Cypress Credit Union one.
That's a monument sign, so that's compliant in the PC zone, and as far as I know, they're just gonna move that same sign back, so.
All right, any other questions for the applicant? All right, thank you, Mr. Knight. Thank you, staff. This is a business item, so there's no public hearing. So we'll move this back to the Planning Commission for further discussion or a motion.
I'll go ahead and make a motion.
All right, Commissioner Harris.
Based on the information and staff analysis and opinions set forth in this staff report and upon the evidence and explanations received today, I move that the Planning Commission approve the sign materials and design for the Gold Coast Plaza sign relocation located at 1411 West, 9000 South in a PC zone with the requirements of approval listed in this report.
Second.
All right, motion by Commissioner Hatch, second by Commissioner Quinney. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Moving on to the next item on our agenda, it's the first and only public hearing for the night, the West Jordan Comprehensive General Plan and Future Land Use Map. Recommendation to the City Council for the adoption of the updated West Jordan Comprehensive General Plan and Future Land Use Map with a citywide applicability, City of West Jordan being the applicant. Ray, we'll turn the time over to you, sir.
Thank you. This one has been a long time coming to the Planning Commission. I think we initially started back in 2020, and in between then and now, there have been a lot of time and effort on part of staff, and particularly the General Plan Committee. We really appreciate all the time and effort and energy that was put into bringing it to this point. So I don't know if I have a lot to say right now, or at this point. We've talked about most of these things in previous meetings. We talked about the state requirements, statutory requirements for having a general plan. We talked about the General Plan Committee and their role in this effort. We also talked about the public participation with our survey and our open houses at the library, and that those comments have been integrated into the general plan, into the context of the general plan. So that's all happened. And then we also walked the Planning Commission through each of the chapters, and then your comments have been added back into the plan. So we're at this point now to where it's the formal public hearing. Up till now, it's basically been discussions with the Planning Commission. So it's now one of those 4 or 5 times when the public actually gets a chance to comment and put in input into that plan. So what we've probably been wondering what we've been doing since October till now, and that is basically we have been formatting the general plan into the draft that you have before you this evening. We hope that you like it. There's been a lot of energy put into that part of it as well. You'll notice that there have been some changes in the chapter layout, not the layout, but the sequencing. So that's really the big change. We've had 4 or 5 or half dozen people take a look at the plan, so we're just at the point now where we're right down to the semicolons and that. So since this is a public hearing, we haven't received any comments from the public, and we're just looking for you. If you have any final comments or questions on the general plan itself, we'd be happy to answer those, and we're looking for a recommendation to the city council at this time. The only other thing is there's been just a couple of small changes to the future land use map, and Mark will just talk you through a couple of those just so that you're aware of those.
All right. So, as you remember, our last meeting where we discussed the general plan, we talked about the future land use map and some of the changes that were made since the Joint Planning Commission City Council workshop. And so, since that discussion, there were just a couple of comments. Actually, there weren't a whole lot of comments since that meeting, but there were a couple changes that I do want to make you aware of. So the first one includes the Home Depot site. Originally, we were going to have this whole area down to the road covered in community commercial, but it turns out Peterson Development is going to end up owning a portion of that. And so we didn't want to really step on their toes and just, take away or interfere with their plans for residential. So essentially, we've just changed that back to the original boundaries of the Home Depot site. So that'll affect just that. And then the other change, and this is kind of where we probably want to get more of your feedback, but it really concerns the southwest quadrant. There's been some ideas put forward to change the research park of this area to match the rest of that southwest quadrant. So that's that new mixed use zone that includes both commercial, professional office, and residential. To include that as part of the larger southwest quadrant, or do we just leave it as a research park as it is? So anyway, with that, it'd be nice to get some of your ideas and feelings on what we should do about that.
I just general question. What does staff feel about that? What are the pros and cons as you've weighed that out, and what would your determination or recommendation be?
We're kind of mixed on it, quite frankly. In terms of the overall development, it's more of kind of a policy question as to whether or not you kind of envision this as being more research park like you'd see at the University of Utah, or if you see it more of a mixed type of development where you have a mix of commercial and residential. We have the I can't remember the exact name of the new zoning that's now in place. That it was the southwest quadrant mixed use zone. I knew it'd pop in there at some point. So we do have that in place, and this would be a great opportunity for that as well. Really, the topography of this lot is this is where you start getting into the foothills, and so it moves. It's getting a little hilly in this location, and I think gets pretty expensive or pretty pricey to develop, large buildings or something that you'd typically see in a research park on that kind of topography. So, there are a couple of reasons why it would make some sense to bring that mixed use area down into that area. But again, it's kind of a judgment call.
All right, Commissioner Wynn?
At our last meeting, we learned more about the balanced housing ordinance. And if I remember right, those percentages were pretty far off right now in terms of the single-family dwellings and multifamily dwellings. Wouldn't it make sense to dedicate part of this quadrant to single-family housing so that we get more balance like the ordinance calls for?
It could. It would be a mixed use type of situation that allow more residential, so there'd be more opportunity for single family. And, like I say, just a mix.
To that end, would it be helpful to refresh the commissioner's memory as to what the southwest quadrant does allow as far as land use? Maybe compare that to the research park. And Ray's right. The business research park designation, or that land use designation, doesn't by its own allow for or consider single family or any attached residential development, whereas the southwest quadrant does. It does have a housing component.
Let's allow Commissioner Quinney to have his thoughts, then maybe we'll
I'm
come
sure
back to
my
that.
thoughts might be answered, Scott, if you want to dive in a little bit there. Did you have more thoughts on that as far as? No?
Well,
Okay.
only if you needed a refresher
All right,
as to
I
what
didn't know
the
I just didn't know if you were done. So
yeah.
my first thought would be, I would be hesitant to get on board with any single family in this area. It's next to Amazon. I mean, this makes no sense. If we're going to build this out as community commercial and whatnot, we should be designing this so that we're pulling people from South Jordan and Harriman to come into here. I don't want to put more houses into this area. I don't honestly see anybody who'd want to live right there, right? We're building really nice houses north of that into the homes area, to the Daybreak area. That just doesn't make sense to build more homes. Single family right there. Not opposed to multifamily, although I know that gets us more out of whack, but I'm also not opposed to that. I had another question though about the Home Depot one. Was that? I just don't remember. You said that it reverted back and we're just going to let Peterson do their thing.
Well,
With-
that as it's now, that is consistent with the Highlands master plan. Before, if we were changing that to community commercial, that would be inconsistent with the Highlands master plan. Peterson's intent was never to develop that portion that was taken back out as commercial. It was either a mixed use or a high density product.
Just, okay, never mind. Then I guess it doesn't matter what I think. All right, that's all I have.
I have a question before we delve into the southwest quadrant. What is is there any hope in the future for being there transit out this way, or any like a TOD zone, or any type of what's expansion out that way as far as access?
Yeah, it would likely be very decades. The closest transit station is the Welby track station to Mark, if you can pan there it is. We've spoken with the employers in that area and UTA in the past to provide a little circulator route from that station through all those businesses. And if we were to see anything in the short term, that's likely what you would see. But as far as along U111, probably the closest BRT or close to a BRT would be on 5600 West.
Commissioner Shelton?
With the research park, I associate that in my mind with it's going to be close to a university. or to the campus, to the university campus of, that they feed off of each other. Can you help me find the relevance of keeping this as a research park in that regard?
Just in looking at the joining uses, I mean, you've got the manufacturing. I think it's important to have some kind of a transition between the heavier industrial uses and then the residential that's to the north. And I think part of that reason for the research park was to provide, in part, that transition. The other part of that was to just improve the overall appearance and you know, provide more of an upscale kind of a commercial, or however research parks are identified. It's not really commercial, but they are in that particular area. So, you know, other than that, I think that was kind of the reason back in 2012 for that.
Yeah, and if I can add to what Ray was saying, the council, and I think it was even more recent than 2012, but the city council, I think it was 2017, 2018, talked about potentially pulling, getting a university satellite extension into this area. Things have changed a lot since that time. And if you look at other research parks, it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to an institution of higher learning. You've got Decker Lake to the north in West Valley City, and there's lots of other examples around the country of research parks where it's more of a campus feel. And so this will be an interesting question to pose to the city council. I know Chair McConaughey was one that spoke a lot about this area, and I don't know if his opinions have changed, but he did champion the cause several years ago. Things have been built in that area that we didn't expect. We've got a lot more big industrial users out there, fulfillment centers, Amazon, and we'll have a couple other distribution services out there. So it'll be curious to see what the council weighs in on. And Ray's right. Staff could go either way. I think there are merits to both sides, but the physical geography of that area in light blue is challenging if you're familiar with it. There's an old gravel pit. There's some very hilly areas. All that green that you see are washes that run through. And so to put big pad sites there would be challenging and very expensive. You can always make it work if you have enough money, but is it the best location? I don't know.
And the research park land use, if the zoning was to, or if it was to be rezoned research park, that's pretty restrictive. I mean, it's a limited use table. The Southwest Quadrant, interestingly enough, allows any of those research office components if it was to be rezoned Southwest Quadrant. But it carries, other uses that also could be in there, some retail, commercial uses, and industrial along with housing. However, the ordinance requires it to be done in a master planned way. So I think that the Southwest Quadrant actually gives the city more control, in my opinion. Now, so that's food for thought, whether that's a better tool or not. I haven't personally believe it is, but the council is the one that makes the policy decisions after receiving a recommendation from you. And the housing component of the Southwest Quadrant, that has to be specifically approved by the Planning Commission and Council, the location for that. So, you can, if they apply for that zoning, say, no, we don't like housing in that location because it's just terrible, you know. And so I think that that tool does give you much more latitude, much more negotiating power than the simple research park. This is a massive piece of property. It's well over 600 acres. So, you know, I don't envision there being, with the topography that's been spoken of, the washes, the little hills and valleys, I don't expect there to be one specific type of use as when you get farther east, you know, in the dry farms. I think there'll be many, many different types of uses in there. So in my opinion, the Southwest Quadrant land use category makes more sense. That's my opinion, so.
So maybe as a clarification for us, is staff looking for the planning commission to say one or the other, and that's what's presented to the city council? Or, okay, so you do want an answer on this? You're right. Commissioner Wynn?
It seems to me that with as much ambiguity as there is surrounding that whole area, that we don't want to do anything that's going to tie your hands or tie the city's hands. We want to have as much flexibility as possible. Which option gives the city the most flexibility?
That would be the Southwest Quadrant for sure. In fact, that's probably the most flexible zone we have currently, just because it allows not just commercial, not just residential, but pretty much all of the above. And like Larry said, it's done in a master plan way, so it really allows for more flexibility based. It's really more of a form based type of development rather than just a strict Euclidean.
Yeah, I'm just looking through the list of permitted and conditional uses for that zone, and it's very broad. It's everything from retail to manufacturing to multifamily and single family dwellings. So,
All right, Commissioner Hatch?
I'd just like to commend staff and the General Plan Commission. I mean, this is the change from what it was to what it is now is you've spent some significant time cleaning it up. I think it looks great. When I went through this earlier, or at the end of last week, it feels like it's really cohesive unit. It all makes sense. It flows together. So great job done by everyone. And I would be in favor of going with the Southwest Quadrant for that zoning.
All right, any other questions for staff before we go into a public hearing? Commissioner Shelton?
Not a question so much as a comment. I feel like in this case of the Southwest Quadrant versus Research Park, the city council is probably going to do what they want to do anyway, regardless of what we suggest. But I would be in favor of the Southwest Quadrant. I like the flexibility it offers. Thank you.
All right, well, this has been noticed as a public hearing, so we will now open this up to the public. Please, if you're here, staff, here, and you want to speak as a public, feel free to come up to the podium. 3 minutes. Do we have anyone online? All right, well, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing and bring it back to the Planning Commission for further discussion or a motion. Commissioner Wynn?
Does the Southwest Quadrant issue require a separate vote? No?
You could, staff will obviously put forward what your recommendations are. If you wanted to include it in any motion as you're passing it on to the council, that might be the best way to do it. You could, motion to approve with the recommendation, and then just however you want to sum up what you were just saying with the recommendation for that area to be the Southwest Quadrant general plan designation or whatever. So.
Then I would make that motion that the Planning Commission forward a positive recommendation to the City Council to approve the updated general plan and future land use map, including those 600 or so acres being designated as Southwest Quadrant.
Commissioner Shelton?
I second the motion.
All right, it has been motioned by Commissioner Wynn, second by Commissioner Shelton. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Great, motion carries 6-0. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
All right, we are adjourned.
Commissioner Thomas chimes in.
Recording stopped.